Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into something pretty fascinating from the Vietnam War, something maybe not everyone knows a lot about, the Chu Hoi program.
That's right. It ran from about 1963 to 71.
Right, and it was this huge effort by the U.S. and South Vietnam, the GBN, to get Viet Cong and NVA soldiers to, well, defect.
And the numbers are kind of staggering when you first see them. Over 194,000 personnel reportedly came over through Chu Hoi. Neutralized, as the term is often used.
Yeah, neutralized. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Trying to persuade your enemy to just switch sides in the middle of a war. It's a whole different angle on the conflict.
It absolutely is. And when you shared the sources, particularly this declassified ARPA report, it just jumps out as, a really rich area. We usually focus on the battles, the big strategy moves. But Chu Hoi, it's about the hearts and minds battle, right down to the individual level. Why did people fight? And what could possibly make them stop?
Exactly. And for you, our listener who pointed us towards this, maybe you're looking at counterinsurgency tactics or perhaps historical attempts at reconciliation. Or maybe you're just like us, kind of captivated by this really unusual approach.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to unpack this, figure out why it was created, how it worked or sometimes didn't work, and what we can learn from it about conflict, maybe even about reconciliation. We're digging into that report you mentioned, the one for the Advanced Research Projects Agency.
And what's clear from the get-go is that this program wasn't static. It changed a lot, especially in the early days, say 63 to 65.
So it started as a U.S. idea, mostly, seeing it as a counterinsurgency tool.
Largely, yes. The report mentions people like Sir Robert Thompson, he was with the British Advisory Mission, and Rufus Phillips from USOM. They were apparently key in sort of selling the idea to President Diem and New.
Must have taken some convincing, I'd imagine, getting something like that off the ground.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. You can imagine the skepticism. Can you trust defectors? Will it even make a difference? And those early years, the report is quite clear, were messy.
Messy how?
Well, coordination was a big problem. You had different U.S. agencies, different GVN departments, not always pulling in the same direction. Plus, it was underfunded, and the people running it often weren't really trained for this kind of delicate work.
Sounds like a recipe for, well, difficulty.
It highlights a classic problem, doesn't it? Great idea, maybe, but making it work on the ground across bureaucracies in a war zone, that's the real challenge.
And you see that in the numbers, right? Those early figures.
Yeah.
About 16,000 ralliers by 65.
Yeah, and even then, the report questions if all those were, legitimate defections.
What also struck me was the cost initially only about $400,000. And the benefits they offered weren't huge either. It feels very tentative.
Exactly, like a pilot program almost. Testing the waters without throwing huge amounts of money at it initially.
But then things started to change around 66.
Yeah, the report notes a definite uptick. Better coordination, more GVN involvement. The numbers started to climb. Doubled that year, actually.
Okay, so better organization made a difference.
It showed the potential, definitely. When they started putting more resources and effort behind it, it began to yield more results.
All right, let's shift gears a bit. The motivations. This is key, right?
Yeah.
Why did people join the VC in the first place? And then why leave? What does the report say about VC recruitment?
It's complex. Ideology and nationalism were definitely factors, especially for some leaders. But it wasn't the only thing. The report talks about propaganda, yes, but also cajoling, sometimes tricking people.
And just straight up drafting, conscription.
Exactly. But we also have to acknowledge the VC were often good at recruiting. They had disciplined local leaders, they understood local grievances, and they could offer things, purpose, maybe personal advantage, especially to younger people, or those feeling left out by the GVN system.
So not just one simple reason. The report actually breaks it down, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Coercion, sort of a mix, or pure volunteering. And the reasons listed are things like nationalism, ideology, sure, but also wanting a better economic situation, being angry about GVN or U.S. actions, or just personal stuff, bad experiences.
Precisely. It paints a much more nuanced picture. And then when you look at why people rallied, why they defected to the GVN side, the motivations shift again.
Less ideological, more personal.
That's what the report strongly suggests. The biggest factor seems to have been the sheer hardship and danger of being a VC fighter, especially as the GV-NUS military pressure increased.
Just war weariness setting in.
Absolutely. Life in the jungle, constant fear, maybe seeing friends killed, doubts creeping in about whether the VC could actually win. It all added up.
And maybe disillusionment with the VC themselves, their tactics.
That too. The report mentions disillusionment with policies, sometimes revulsion at VC terrorism against civilians, and of course the simple, powerful desire to go home, see family again.
And the Chiu Hoi program itself became known as an option.
Yes, critically. It was advertised leaflets, radio as this open door, a way out.
And they offered specific things, right? Like a break from military service on the GVN side.
6 months.
A 6-month determinant, yeah.
Yeah.
And security permits, which could potentially allow them to go back to their villages. Tangible things.
Well, this must have seemed pretty appealing.
You'd think so. But the VC didn't make it easy. They saw rallying as a massive betrayal, a tremendous crime.
Punishments.
Severe ones. Threats, beatings, even executions for suspected defectors or their families. The report mentions this chilling 1970 VC announcement, the Order of the Valiant Knights.
What was that?
It basically offered rewards for killing Hoi Chan, the returnees. It shows how seriously they viewed the threat Chiu Hoi posed to their manpower.
Wow. So deciding to rally took incredible courage then, knowing the risks.
Absolutely. You were potentially risking everything.
Okay, so the program grows, adapts. What about the period from 66 to 69? That seems like a key phase. U.S. involvement increased.
Significantly. 1967 was a big year with the creation of CORDS.
Civil operations and revolutionary development support. It basically put all the U.S. civilian agencies working on counterinsurgency under one umbrella, including Chiu Hoi. The idea was better coordination.
Makes sense. And USAID and GSPO were involved.
Yeah, USAID provided a lot of the funding and support, and GSPO, the Joint U.S. Public Affairs Office, handled the psychological operations, the PSYOP side. The U.S. was footing a large part of the bill by this point.
And 69 was the peak year. Over 47,000 ralliers.
That's the number reported. The analysis suggests 3 main reasons for that surge.
Okay, what were they?
First, the program itself was just better organized internally by then. They'd learned lessons. Second, GVN and U.S. forces had expanded control over more territories, so there was just a bigger pool of potential ralliers they could reach.
Right.
And third, security was improving in some GVN areas, and there was some economic progress, making the GVN side look like a more stable, viable option.
And the cost per rallier went up too, you said, to $350.
Yeah, reflecting that bigger investment, more resources going in.
And the GVN itself was stepping up more. It became a ministry.
It did. Chiu Hoi became a full ministry in the South Vietnamese government, which was a big step. The report mentions Nguyen Ngoc An as a particularly dynamic leader on the GVN side. That institutional buy-in was really important.
Let's talk about those PSYOPs. JUSPAO's role. Leaflets, radio, what else?
All sorts of things. Leaflets dropped by the millions, banners, posters, films shown in villages, radio broadcasts aimed at VC areas, even loudspeakers on planes or mounted on vehicles sometimes.
It must have been tricky getting the message right, trying to sell the GVN when the VC often had a strong nationalist appeal.
Definitely. They had to focus on those personal motivations, the hardships, the danger, the desire for family, and contrast it with the safety and benefits offered by Chiu Hoi. The Safe Conduct Pass was huge here.
The pass?
Yeah, it was a printed document, often shown on leaflets, basically promised safe passage and good treatment if a VC soldier came over holding it. A tangible symbol of that open door.
They also used these. Armed propaganda teams. APNTs. That sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Yeah. It does, doesn't it? But the idea was interesting. These were teams made up of Hoi Chan, former VC themselves.
Ah, so they used ex-VC to recruit more VC.
Exactly. They go into contested areas, sometimes even VC areas, and use their own stories, their credibility, to persuade others. They carried weapons for self-defense, hence the armed part.
Were they effective?
They seem to have been, at least in some cases. They were organized militarily, teams, squads, companies, and their weapons apparently got heavier over time, suggesting they were involved in more than just talking.
How many were there?
By 1970, the report says around 84 companies, but it also notes they weren't always used as intended. Sometimes they ended up as guards or in static defense roles.
Resource management issues again.
Seems like it. Always a challenge in that environment.
Then there were the Kit Carson Scouts. Also ex-VC, but a different role.
Yes, very different. Kit Carson Scouts volunteered specifically to work with U.S. and GVN military units. They weren't primarily about propaganda.
What did they do?
Intelligence. They used their knowledge of VC tactics, tunnel systems, supply routes, booby traps. Invaluable stuff for the combat units. They helped locate enemy positions, identify infiltrators, interrogate prisoners.
Sounds dangerous. Were they treated like regular soldiers?
The report mentions a directive saying they shouldn't be given more hazardous tasks than regular troops, and they went through careful screening. It also says they could get U.S. and Vietnamese awards, which suggests their contribution was valued.
Okay, so the program had these different elements, periods of growth. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. What were the major roadblocks?
Well, we touched on one, that lingering distrust within the GVN itself. Skepticism about the ralliers' real motives, which led to bureaucratic foot-dragging, especially when it came to helping them after they left the reception centers.
And the centers themselves had problems.
Yes. Overcrowding was common. The report mentions mistreatment by staff sometimes, even corruption like skimming off the allowances meant for the Hoi Chan.
That kind of news must have gotten back to the VC side.
Undoubtedly. It could really hurt the program's credibility. If the promise wasn't matching the reality, why would you risk defecting?
What about resettling them? Helping them find work, fit back in?
That was another huge hurdle. Not enough trained people to help them navigate the system. Private companies were often reluctant to hire ex-VC. The stigma was real.
Security concerns too, I suppose.
Right. And even the special Chu Hoi hamlets they set up had issues. Sometimes they lacked the support of extended family networks, and they could be targets for VC attacks or intimidation.
And the numbers fluctuated quite a bit, didn't they? Depending on what else was happening in the war.
Very much so. Big military events like the Tet Offensive in '68 caused a dip. Why rally if it looked like the VC were still strong, or maybe even winning?
Political uncertainty too.
Right.
Like elections or the Paris talks.
Exactly. People might wait and see which way the wind was blowing before committing. And underneath it all was that constant debate. Was this really hurting the enemy significantly? Were these people truly won over, or just taking a break?
Those are tough questions to answer definitively, even looking back.
Very tough.
So moving into the later years, 1970, 71, the focus of the war was shifting.
Yeah, more towards pacification, internal security, consolidating GVN control. Vietnamization was underway.
And the Chuhoi numbers started going down.
They did. One theory mentioned in the report is that maybe the low-hanging fruit, the less committed soft-core VC, had already rallied in earlier years.
So they adjusted their strategy.
It seems so. There was a bigger push to attract higher-ranking VC and NVA officers or political cadre. The thinking was that getting even one high-level defector could provide huge intelligence payoffs and be a bigger blow to enemy morale.
Do they offer them more? Better treatment?
Generally, yes. More intensive political re-education, better vocational training, potentially better prospects after release.
And they tried to link Chuhoi with other programs, like
Phoenix program, yeah. That was focused on dismantling the Viet Cong infrastructure, the VCI, the political and administrative network.
How do they work together?
Mainly intelligence sharing. Information from Hoi Chan could help identify VCI targets for Phoenix. And maybe someone targeted by Phoenix might be persuaded to rally via Chu Hoi instead.
Trying to coordinate the different efforts.
Exactly. They also tried to improve the follow-up support for Hoi Chan after they left the centers. Getting village chiefs involved, better tracking.
More focus on jobs and skills, too.
Definitely. Trying to give them skills to actually make a living in the GVN economy. Though the report notes this was still hampered by the overall economic situation and GVN bureaucracy. And interestingly, it points out many Hoi Chan didn't want to just go back to being peasants. They had aspirations.
Which makes successful reintegration even harder if those opportunities aren't there.
Precisely. And all this was happening under the banner of the GVN's official National Reconciliation Policy, trying to present this image of welcoming back former enemies.
So summing it all up, over 194,000 defectors. That's the big number. What's the final take on the program's impact?
Well, you can't ignore that number. It clearly drained manpower from the VCNVA. That's undeniable.
And provided intelligence.
Yes, and propaganda value. Politically, it showed that many people were willing to leave the communist side, even if they weren't necessarily becoming passionate GVN supporters. It signaled a loss of faith or motivation for a significant chunk of the enemy force.
What about the cost-effectiveness argument? Some people thought it was a better deal than fighting.
The report mentions that viewpoint from people working in the program, that neutralizing an enemy soldier through defection was potentially far cheaper, in both money and lives, than doing it through combat.
A compelling argument.
It is. But measuring the long-term success, how well these individuals reintegrated, whether it truly changed the political tide, that's much harder. The report suggests maybe those measurements came too late or weren't fully possible before the end of the war.
So, for our listener who got us started on this, It's clear the Chu Hoi program was huge, complex, and definitely impactful. It mixed big strategic goals with intensely personal decisions.
And it changed so much over time, facing all sorts of challenges, but achieving, some notable results, at least numerically.
Hopefully this dive gave you some insights, whether you were curious about the motivations, the tactics, or just the human side of it all.
Yeah, did any part particularly stand out, the reasons people joined versus why they left, the PSYOPs, the Kit Carson Scouts? It's all quite something.
And maybe one final thought to chew on. Thinking about programs like Chu Hoi more broadly, where else might you see strategies like this? What are the ethical lines when you're trying to convince someone to abandon their side, their comrades?
And does that focus on personal needs and weariness rather than just ideology? Hold lessons for other conflicts today? How do you genuinely achieve reconciliation after trying to turn people against their former cause?
Lots to think about there.
Yeah.
It's definitely more complicated than just counting defectors. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.